Okay, we've got another PHNX call here, which obviously, as always, will be recorded, popped into the library, and accessible to go through at whatever speed, frequency you want. And always feel free to reach out if there are any questions or anything that you want to go over. Door is always open. So today we are looking at quite an important topic, which I believe is and can be a key in unlocking client potential towards the goals that they've set. Obviously, as always, I kind of focus these in on health, fitness related goals because the demographic. But if you're a coach and you are coaching broader areas of one's life, then those things that we cover also can be very readily applied. I have and am applying some of these models that we're going to go through literally, week by week with some of the guys which I'm coaching. So when we think on assertiveness and how it can be a key to unlocking a client's progress, it has to really reflect on what's happening beneath the surface. As we've said here, we're focusing on the training program, nutrition plan, recovery protocol. So let's sort of think about that from a health and fitness perspective. And then what happens underneath are things like family pressures, work expectations, inability to say no, emotional labor, boundary erosion, social food pushers. There are probably more things that happen that waver people off track and create tangent from the direction they need to be traveling. Now, some of these things are naturally going to come into play and not necessarily be that much of a magnitude, or in some cases, the person might have to just relinquish, say, for example, workplace expectations might crank up, or there might be added family pressures for a period of time for whatever reasons. However, it is really important that when you're working with clients is that there is a level of awareness of around how assertive they are being within their environments that they find themselves in, and whether lack of assertiveness is almost, or lack of communication around being boundaries and being assertive is undermining. Now, we can't determine everything that's going to happen when a client is faced with the obstacles that they're faced with. So there has to be a certain amount of self capability that is born from the coaching that you do when you're thinking about how can I make my client more assertive. It's worth noting that it's a skill. Assertiveness is a skill. And I was having this conversation the other day, and we were talking about what would be seen as a trait or what would be seen as a skill or an application of a skill. Things like compassion isn't a personality trait; it's a skill. Assertiveness is a skill. Resilience is a skill. And when we are working with clients, there can be almost an internalized thought process of them which aligns them to saying, I'm just not an assertive person, or I'm just, I'm not that confident. I can't speak my mind. I just don't speak my mind. As it almost falls into this sense of, when we consider learned self-helplessness, that there is a sense that they don't really believe that they can be and fill that space of being an assertive person. When you think why that might be is how they perceive assertiveness. It might be misaligned with actual aggression, or being rude or blunt, or being overly demanding when it's not. So we have to understand that people's perceptions are, they could be a personality trait or their perceptions of what being assertive is. And it's really quite a critical point to actually understand what our clients believe about assertiveness before we start the road of coaching assertiveness. Otherwise, they might be very hands off, or they might be very reluctant to embrace it if at the start of the process of coaching assertiveness, they have a complete misperception of what it is. So the reality obviously is something that we need to, it's learnable, it's intentional communication skill. It can be sensitive into different dynamics and different contexts that you find in. It's not, it's dialable, which we'll come on to. It's not, it's not like this is what assertiveness is. It depends on the situation where you can switch and adjust. And a balance between obviously self advocacy and mutual respect. So, yes, I am putting myself in a place of importance, but I respect the other person as well. That is essentially assertiveness. So, core definition, clarity, self advocacy, and respect. And this kind of brings together a lovely little diagram, Venn diagram here, that creates a focal point in the middle of assertiveness, the ability to say what you need, think, and will not do clearly, calmly, and respectfully. So, it's important when we are understanding that these three things need to come together in order for the generating of an assertive position is to be found. Never a one size fits all. So, just defining the seesaw of assertiveness. That's what I'm going to call this. So, assertiveness is the ability to say what you need, think, or will not do clearly, calmly, and respectfully. It's learnable behaviour skill, not personality trait. It does not mean dominance or bluntness, and it is context sensitive. Different cultures, relationships, different environments you might find yourself in, and also safety. But the seesaw here is the point of this slide because sometimes it goes from side to side, right? You will find that clients during phases of training, during times that you're coaching them, they will waver and the seesaw will go from one way or to the other or will be in equilibrium. So the speaking frankly, it's very unlikely that I find myself having to deal with clients over the years that have positioned themselves in underweighting the other person, i.e., imposing their thoughts, feelings in a coercive manner or in a way in which it is a detriment to people in their environment. I don't normally find that. It's always the majority of the time the person I'm coaching is underweighing themselves and they are being supplicative, suppressing their own needs, and they're not finding themselves putting their needs, wishes, or requirements in a place of importance. So you have the sense of the balance whereby you have this self-respect and respect for others, which creates a very harmonious position. Four communication styles that we will see when we are having conversations with clients. Now, when we are getting our clients to tell us stories, which is essentially how we actually find out what the hell's going on in their life, whilst we're having these opportunities to listen as to whether they, whether they were being subjected to someone who was being aggressive, passive aggressive, whether they were being passive or assertive, all of these different styles of communication will be revealed when a client tells you about a story about work, a story about a relationship that they're in, a story about the friend circle that they've spent the weekend with. All these things, if you listen and you communicate and you hear, you will know whether other person was pushing their needs on your client, whether they are in a relationship where there's a certain amount of passive aggressive communication which is creating confusion for them, or whether in fact they were able to communicate what they wanted with clarity and be assertive in a certain situation. So being able to listen to when these threads of style come through in the conversation you're having with a client is critical to know whether you need to lean into assertive coaching and whether it's something that is going to benefit them, and then also how is it going to benefit them? In what sense is it going to be useful for the progression of their journey and the goals they're looking to achieve? If you think how you are as a coach and the communication that you have as a coach, and this is something that is part of reflection, it is part of supervision. I've got supervision later on today, and I will be having a conversation around how I am communicating with some of the guys in the city that I'm coaching, which essentially is important for me to know what my communication is with them. Am I being assertive enough? Some of them are quite well, they are and hold their positions in a very strong way, and they need some assertive communication back towards them. I can't be passive. So, do I sometimes communicate in a passive way to clients? Potentially, but that's part of having the reflections and looking at the supervision, because it is inevitable that your own communication style as a coach can often model what the kind of communication style is acceptable to a client. So having and being able to reflect on your own communication styles is particularly important. And with AI nowadays, if you're delivering, let's say for example, you're delivering a Loom check-in, or you are transcribing on a one-to-one you're having with a client on Zoom or Teams or whatever, there is an opportunity here to take this particular framework and go, I want you to look at this framework and go, how and when was I communicating in any of these particular ways? And it can have the ability to highlight that. So, reflection and understanding of your own communication style as a coach is super important. Now, when we are stepping into this space to deliver assertiveness coaching to clients, let's say, for example, there's a client who is working. Okay, let's take it. Let's take a live example that I have. Let's take. I can't say her name because confidentiality, but let's take Martha, and she has and is working in a VC setup, and she's the role that she is reporting into the owner of the fund, right? So lots going on here. Now there's pulling and pushing from pillar to post for Martha, and she is not getting the right kind of time, respect, options, capability to look after herself. Self-care, not there, right? So we need, as a coach, to firstly highlight there's lack of self-care, but now we also need to structure something which allows Martha to have the right conversation in the right way with the person whom is restricting her capability of self-care, so that she can start to reach the goals that she wants to achieve. Some of them are actually other goals, not just health and fitness, but they are part of that. So having this conversation is, well, what do we do as a coach? Dictating what that person says doesn't work. The problem that we have, and the trap we fall into as on this slide, if we try to dictate what that person has to say, is that they don't come across as authentic and genuine. They come across as if they're effectively a conduit of someone else that's telling them what they have to say. So we have to elicit their voice so it can actually have the authenticity and power that is required to find the assertive position. If we don't do that and we fall into the trap of writing the script for them, then it can come across and be misread and have a negative effect. So we want them to discover their own voice, open questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. Oars. We know oars from motivational interviewing. Good use of it here. And you have to explore this area before you go into actually being able to implement a particular framework of assertive coaching, or the tool which is used. So the right framework is dependent on the context in which the individual is finding themselves. All of these, all of these work perfectly well. By the way, it's not like there's one better or one that should be lent into anymore. I'm interested to know. I actually sent some questions for us to discuss at the end. I'm not sure if it's been seen, but we can cover them anyway because it's a small group, so it's fine. But when we think about the different frameworks that you might be leaning into, we can see like everyday friction, reoccurring conflict, and boundary violations tends to be more in a work environment. That is the one that I see more and more with individuals that relinquish any kind of position of assertion, and it tends to happen there. So in work environments, repeated social pressure and high emotion or shame. So if we were going to focus on the I statement, something that would be best used for just small little misunderstanding, it can happen. I mean, this is actually a particularly useful statement in relationships, in personal relationships. So, whether it be friends, partners, this I feel when, because, and then what is required as a need or a want with clarity is really useful because it structures the conversation in such a way that it is pretty impenetrable when it comes down to that person moving into an assertive place. From a supplicative to an assertive place, this is a particularly strong structure because it stays quite neutral. It doesn't put the emphasis on the individual, so it's not attacking the other individual in any way. It's making a very neutral observation, and it's the focus is how the person that's moving into a certain position is feeling, what emotion they're feeling. And you can't deny someone's emotion. If they're feeling it, they're feeling it, and that's that. So it's a very strong structure for bringing in to personal potential confrontation when that individual wants to move themselves into an assertive place. Desk model. So the structure here, describe the specific situation, the behavior objectively. So, I mean, in work, you kind of have people that act up within work. So kind of being able to describe their behaviors objectively can be a challenge at times, but essentially you then go on to express the concern or feeling without the blame, suggest what you want to happen, and notice it's suggest because obviously it's a little bit more of a formal rather than I want or need. It's like I potentially we could do this. How do you think? How are you feeling that? And then obviously the consequences of the impact of that change has happened. How will we move forward? If you're thinking on a if you're working with a client and they are, there's an example here. The load keeps being progressed despite a pain flare, what being worried about injury, expressing the concern, scaling it is the suggestion, and then maintaining consistency would be the consequence, positive consequence that happens, right? So you can see if you set that out in a communicative way, and you have a client that is capable of communicating like that, that's a good thing when it comes to them being able to be assertive within a session. And your let's say, for example, you're delivering a session and the person clearly is in a bit of pain or is struggling, but they're not saying anything, and you can tell that they might be a bit worried, they potentially would benefit from scaling. Obviously, as a coach, you're going to make the decision to scale it and also to protect that person from safety in order for them to not get injured or be able to train later on in the week. But that's not the point. The point is, if they don't say anything, that is the key. If they are like continuing on without pushing back on you as a coach and going, hang on a minute, let's just assess this situation. This isn't working. I'm in too much pain. It is a key indication that that is not them being assertive, right? Even though you're in a position of authority, it's not about authority, it's about collaboration, and you need to be and hold a position. So it's an interesting, I've had clients before which have been pushing on, and I've gone, look, Johnny, what's going on here? Okay, yeah, but I don't want to let you down, or yeah, I don't want to let myself down. I need to push on. I'm like, no, 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 no. You need to tell me about what's going on here, and we need to assess the situation. And it's almost like creating a window of opportunity for them to practice being assertive. Because if they're not assertive with you, a point of authority, are they also lacking that assertion elsewhere? I don't know. It's not definite, but it's worth thinking about when you're coaching. The broken record is as it sounds, a monotonous approach, but unfortunately, there is a sense, and this probably comes around in more so with like people like staying out a bit later when they need to get home, or drinking is another one which you tend to see this happening where people have to repeat themselves time and time again like a broken record and bat off the social pressure. So this is like a social pressure one that can happen. Now, being assertive and finding that assertive voice, if you don't fit someone else's agenda of what they want to do, they can become potentially manipulative and coercive. So it's even more important to be assertive and hold your ground. So when we're talking about our clients and how and what progress is being stalled because of their lack of competency in being assertive, when they're in social situations, this is a key to unlocking that and being able to provide them with the strength and robustness to hold their own course of decision making. Now, do we get things right first time? No. No, 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 no. We do not get things right first time because it just doesn't work like that. I've had over the years clients where I've had to create the opportunity for them to rehearse, and a bit weird at first, but once it's almost like role play basically. It's like having conversations like, so okay, so you know, let obviously check in with them first and be like, look, should we just, rather than just start this random role play, so say, look, maybe we could try this, how do you feel about doing this? And it could be in between sets, you could have this conversation. If it's a virtual loom, it could be like, let's jump on the call and have a bit of a role play. It doesn't matter how it's set up, but essentially what you're trying to do is create a almost demonstrative environment where that person can either be shown how you would speak in an assertive way given that situation, the opportunity to practice. You can maybe push back a little bit and with some feedback, retry it, and then off you go again. So taking it as a opportunity to align with the task at hand. It's no good saying, oh yeah, off you go and go and be assertive. It's like, well, what does assertiveness look like? For some people, they don't know. So the rehearsal cycle, you know, and in some cases, in like the therapeutic coaching, it's almost you bring in like, imagine you are talking to, hypothetically speaking, what would you say in this situation? And if you're then looking at your client and they aren't answering with conviction, their body language or tone of voice is off, you need to do a bit of work, because actually when they get into the scenario, they're going to be even more unsteady. So they're unsteady in a practice one, they're going to be even more unsteady in the real one. So kind of having this opportunity and this openness to exercise being assertive and building that skill in a safe environment. And you can do it really subtly as well. I mean, there are ways you can do it subtly, with good questioning and pushing back and kind of having them reflect on how they would communicate. And when we are looking at these setups with regards to, is this person really ready? If they're communicating in a way in which it's very vague, indirect, seem to be tripping over loads of words or loosely going, well, it might be your fault doing that, or, and there's no conviction, too vague, it's not going to be good enough. If they're almost there, so they've got clarity, but they might be missing like actually saying what they want to happen, because that's the part in which there is this trip hazard. You can almost bring it around, well, this is what's happening, this is how I feel. But then when that assertive person has to say, this is what I want, that is the bit where they go, oh, I'm not going to say it. And then they just kind of melt away a bit. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but they kind of melt away a bit and go, oh, I'll say it another time. So it's the almost there, but not quite. And then the mastered is where they clear, respectful, specific. They are being assertive in the right context with appropriate ways in communicating, and then having that boundary or that request firmed up and sitting quite strong. A little checklist here. Factual opening, owns the message, no blaming or aggressive language, contains a very clear request or limit, and sounds authentic to the client's normal voice. That's super important, that last bit, because if they're pretending to be someone and say something and it's not, it will be uncomfortable at first. But if it's too performative and disingenuous, then it will get ignored and canned by the person that's receiving the message. I've been there. So bridging the gap, this is essentially what you would probably want to discuss when you are coaching assertiveness with your clients. You've got the plan, you've got the assertive statement. It's like, okay, cool. You've practiced it. You sound pretty good. We're 2.5, 2.7, almost on 3. Cool. Let's talk about what happens when you enter that space of vulnerability, because that's what they've got to do. If you're working with a client and they've got to be assertive because stuff just isn't working out for them in what they want to achieve and where they want to go, they have to step into a space of risk. They have to take risk, and it's going to feel terrifying at times. What if they push back? What if they start being narky with me? What if they start, kind of saying, oh, why do you want to do this now? Whether you're at work, personal, it doesn't matter. There is the risk. So one thing that I have found fairly useful when working with clients and they're going into this space where it is going to be vulnerable is to get them to imagine that and almost put themselves in that somatic area where they could get a bit more of a heart rate. They could feel their palms a bit sweaty, because this is what happens when people who are finding their feet and being assertive feel like. This is what they feel like. Shit, I've got to have that conversation. Heart rate up, palms are sweaty, you know, jittery and a bit worried. This is what they feel like. So to get them into that space, but then get them to regulate when they're going into that risky space will be the key in them being able to be assertive and learn the skill and implement the skill and then follow through on that. We mentioned about context earlier, and this is really the slide that drills down into the context side of things. So it isn't a one size fits all. Nothing really ever is, right? General principles individually applied. Assertiveness, general principle. How do we individually apply it? Well, we individually apply it by thinking of a couple of different things. Who are we speaking to, for a start? Is a clear indication. So are we speaking to a friend, a colleague, a peer, a family member, a niece, a nephew, a dad? It doesn't matter. Who are you talking to? And then what do we need to do in order to be able to dial in the softer, more direct approach, the intensity, how intentional do we need to be in our voice, and all of these will help build the right kind of communication and deliver it in the right kind of way for the assertive position to be welcomed and understood and embraced by the receiver of said signal, of said message. And it's a sweet spot. And again, it's a skill that sometimes you'll get right and sometimes you'll get wrong. So as a coach, you even have to think about how assertive can you be with your client. So looking at it from a principle of, if I'm going to have a chat with Martha, I might have a different kind of assertive conversation than I would do if I'm going to have a chat with Johnny, or a new client versus a client that I've known for 3 years or 4 or 5 years. I've got a client who I've coached for 10 years, and the way in which we communicate is very different from someone who I've only coached for a year or 6 months. I have and can have different assertive tone and delivery with the client. So that's important as well from that perspective, from a coach development point of view. Where do I dial in the assertive communication with this particular client? Because actually, that's a skill that you're then modeling to them to do, to dial in their assertiveness where it's required in the context speaking. Coaches mirror protecting your own boundaries. I mean, this is a super important factor. So if you don't model if you don't model behaviors, assertiveness being one of them, skill, that's a skill. If you don't compassion, if you don't model compassion, if you don't model good regulation and coping skills, like within moments and communicate them effectively, it's difficult for your clients to be able to have a good point of reference. We see that in things like response times. If you are a coach that tends to want to step in and rescue, that's, you can kind of like overextend yourself there, which, as we know from previous calls, overextension over a period of time leads to burnout potential. Scope creep. If you're starting to, it sounds a bit weird, that, doesn't it? Scope creep. If you're looking to starting to go into different areas which are outside of your scope, obviously that's a boundary and that's melting away, and all you're doing is modeling there to a client that that's appropriate for that to happen. And emotional labor, where you manage your own energy and whether you're absorbing your stress. So having that kind of setup that doesn't allow for emotional labor to build up too much and take too much of control. And when we think about how we bring in the idea of behavior change into the idea of that of a coach's journey, and we're looking at values and boundaries that then come together to form the overall success. Knowing values, having boundaries, eliciting behavior change, and having that in a sustainable way, which is protected by the capability of being assertive. If something's going against your values, you can communicate that clearly in an assertive way. If someone is encroaching on your boundaries, you can communicate that in an assertive way. If someone is stopping your behavior that you want to elicit and it's your decision, you can communicate that in an assertive way. And you can see how it brings together it's not a guarantee, but it's a higher potential chance of moving along that coaching journey. As always, we have a quick reflection on scope of practice. So, working with your clients, you're in a situation where you impart an accountability partner, a collaborator, a provider of insight and opportunity to learn. What you're not is is a psychotherapist, unless you are a psychotherapist listening to this, in which case crack on. When you're looking at kind of red flags, like if there's coercive control, unsafe relationships, and more with the therapeutic coaching that I've delivered, I've had to make some tough calls around unsafe relationships. And I've had to make some tough calls around coercive control. It does happen. And, sometimes there are different approaches that have to be taken, referring out, and especially if things start to get into more of the clinical side of things, and that's obviously very important to do that. So, if you need to bring someone in, and I've always said this, my approach is if something goes out of my scope practice, which is potentially a bit wider than other, well, it is other wider than other coaches, but if something goes out of my scope of practice, I've got people that I can bring in to support and co-manage to a certain degree, which I think is a very valuable position to be able to find oneself in. So that's a little bit on assertive coaching and how that can fit in and the benefits of that from a perspective of delivering it to clients, but also being able to, hold a position of assertion within your own practice for yourself as a coach. Thanks for listening, and that's it for today.